There is a city on the western edge of Europe where the pubs still fill up on a Thursday night, where the cobblestones along the quays still glisten in the rain, where the accents are warm and the conversation flows easy. From the outside, Dublin looks exactly like it always did. Charming, literary, alive with a particular kind of energy that other capitals have spent decades trying to manufacture. But spend a week talking to the people who actually live there, and a different picture emerges. Not loudly, not with protests or riots or the kind of visible rupture that makes international headlines, quietly. In the way that a family packs up after 30 years in Ranelagh because the landlord just doubled the rent. In the way that a nurse finishes a night shift at Beaumont and commutes 90 minutes back to a house share in County Meath because there is simply nothing affordable left inside the M50. In the way that a young architect, educated in UCD, working in the city center, cannot imagine ever owning a home in the city his grandparents were born in. Dublin is not collapsing in the dramatic sense. The lights are still on, the cafes are still busy. The tech campuses along the Grand Canal dock still hum with the energy of American money and European ambition. But underneath all of that, something foundational is fracturing. And the people being ground down by it are not outsiders or newcomers. They are Dubliners. They are the city itself. If you want to watch the patterns that history keeps repeating in the cities that believed their own mythology for too long, subscribe. Empire Falls documents the decline that mainstream media keeps dressing up as a success story. To understand what is happening in Dublin today, you have to understand what Dublin was supposed to become, and more importantly, what it actually became instead. In 1987, Ireland was, by any honest measure, a country in crisis. Unemployment was above 17%. Emigration was so severe that the population of the Republic had barely moved in a century. Young people left. They had always left. It was practically written into the cultural DNA. The joke was that the last person to leave should turn off the lights, except nobody was sure there would even be lights left to turn off. What happened next is one of the most discussed economic transformations in modern European history. Ireland made a series of deliberate choices: low corporate tax, heavy investment in education, aggressive courtship of American multinationals. And it worked. By the mid-1990s, economists were calling it the Celtic Tiger. Dublin, for the first time in living memory, was a city people were moving to rather than fleeing from. Google arrived, Microsoft arrived, Facebook arrived, Pfizer, Apple, LinkedIn, Twitter. The Docklands district, once a wasteland of derelict industrial buildings, became something that looked and felt like a miniature San Francisco transplanted to the Irish Sea. For a generation that had grown up watching their parents and siblings take the boat to England, it felt like a miracle. And for a while, it was. But here is the lesson that Dublin forgot. The same lesson that San Francisco forgot, that London forgot, that Amsterdam forgot. When you make your city the headquarters of the global economy, you do not just import jobs. You import a logic, a market logic, a logic that says land and housing are assets first and homes second. And once that logic takes hold, once the spreadsheets start treating the city the way they treat any other investment vehicle, the city stops belonging to the people who built it. Dublin is in year 15 of that logic. And the numbers are now impossible to ignore. The average house price in Dublin in 2024 sits at approximately €450,000. The average household income in Ireland is roughly €50,000 a year. By the standard mortgage multiplier that most banks use, a couple on average combined incomes can reasonably borrow somewhere between 3 and 4 times their joint income. That gets them, if they are lucky, to €300,000. The gap between what ordinary working families can borrow and what a house actually costs in Dublin has become so wide that whole categories of people have effectively been priced out, not of luxury, not of aspirational neighborhoods, but of the city itself, of a semi-detached house with a garden in Clondalkin, of a 2-bedroom apartment in Santry, of anything. And if buying is out of reach, renting offers no relief. The average monthly rent in Dublin is now above €2,000 for a one-bedroom apartment. In the city centre, it is closer to €2,500. For context, the net monthly take-home pay of a secondary school teacher in Ireland is approximately €3,000. A nurse working full-time takes home roughly the same. By the international benchmark that economists use to define housing stress, where no more than 30% of income should go to rent, a Dublin nurse renting a one-bedroom apartment in the city where she works is spending somewhere between 60 and 80% of her take-home pay on a roof over her head. That is not a housing market. That is a trap. But what makes Dublin particularly fascinating as a case study, and particularly instructive as a warning, is not just the numbers, it is who benefits from those numbers. And that is where the story gets uncomfortable. Dublin became expensive because it became desirable to a very specific kind of capital, not the capital of ordinary commerce or local industry, the capital of the global tech economy, of private equity, of institutional real estate investment. In the years following the 2008 financial crisis, as Ireland's property market collapsed and hundreds of thousands of people lost homes they had bought at bubble prices, a new category of buyer emerged: investment funds, real estate investment trusts, entities that in some cases owned tens of thousands of rental units across multiple countries, began acquiring Irish residential property at scale. These were not landlords in the traditional sense. They were not retired teachers renting out a granny flat. They were asset managers optimizing return on investment across a portfolio. And because they were buying at scale, building at scale, and renting at scale, they had an effect on the market that individual landlords never could. They institutionalized the rental market. They turned housing from a social good into a yield-generating product. A former Dublin-based property developer, speaking anonymously to a journalist in 2022, put it this way. He said the moment the Irish government decided to give tax incentives to real estate investment trusts to build in the city, they made a choice. They chose the balance sheets of funds registered in Luxembourg over the ability of Irish people to afford a home in their own capital. Whether that was the intention or not, he said, that was the act. The Irish government has pushed back on this characterization. Officials have pointed to record levels of construction, to new planning legislation designed to speed up development, to shared equity schemes designed to help first-time buyers. And to be fair, the numbers on construction output in Ireland have improved in recent years, but the fundamental problem persists. Supply is chasing a market that has been structurally deformed by the concentration of ownership and the prioritization of investment-grade returns. Building more units into that market does not automatically solve the affordability crisis. Not when the units being built are priced to meet the expectations of institutional capital rather than the reality of Irish wages. This is the part that history keeps trying to teach us, and that we keep refusing to learn. Detroit built cars for the world. And when the world found cheaper cars elsewhere, Detroit was left with infrastructure designed for a scale of prosperity it could no longer sustain. San Francisco built the internet. And when the internet made a small number of people extraordinarily wealthy and distributed that wealth very unevenly across the city's geography, San Francisco was left with a homelessness crisis in the shadow of billion-dollar campuses. Dublin built the European headquarters of the global tech economy, and it did so without adequately asking who the city was being built for. When you build for capital at that scale, capital eventually tells you who the city belongs to. And the people it does not belong to are starting to make different choices. The statistics on Irish emigration have shifted in ways that would have been unthinkable at the peak of the Celtic Tiger. In 2023, the Central Statistics Office reported that emigration from Ireland reached its highest level since 2015. The majority of those leaving were Irish nationals aged between 15 and 44, not failed immigrants returning home, not retirees. Young Irish people, educated in Ireland, looking at the cost of living in Dublin and deciding that the city their parents fought to build a future in is no longer a city they can afford to build a future in themselves. A software engineer in his early 30s, who spent 4 years working for a major tech company in Dublin before relocating to Lisbon in 2023, described his thinking in an interview with an Irish newspaper. He said he was earning a good salary, better than most, and he still could not see a path to buying a home in Dublin that did not involve either enormous financial help from family or spending the next 20 years making no other meaningful financial decisions. In Lisbon, he said, he bought a 2-bedroom apartment 18 months after arriving. He has a terrace. He can see the Tagus. He is 33 years old, and he owns where he lives. In Dublin, he said, that would have been a fantasy. He is not alone, and the pattern he represents is not just a personal anecdote. It is a structural signal. When a city starts losing its educated, productive, working-age population to cities that offer a comparable quality of life at a fraction of the cost, that is not a temporary adjustment. That is a long-term competitive problem that compounds over time. But the emigration of tech workers and young professionals, troubling as it is, may not be the most serious indicator of what is happening in Dublin. The more serious indicator is what is happening to the essential workforce. Every functional city requires what economists call essential workers: teachers, nurses, firefighters, bus drivers, childcare workers, social workers, electricians, plumbers. These are not marginal occupations. They are the circulatory system of urban life. Without them, a city does not just become unpleasant, it stops functioning. In Dublin, in 2024, the Irish Nurses and Midwives Organization reported chronic staffing shortages in hospitals across the capital, with recruitment and retention cited as the primary cause. The reason given, consistently, by nurses who left or chose not to come, was cost of living. Dublin's public bus network, operated by Dublin Bus, has struggled for years to recruit and retain drivers. The HSE, Ireland's health service, has documented significant difficulties recruiting junior doctors willing to take posts in Dublin, as opposed to other Irish cities or abroad. A former HSE recruitment manager, speaking to an Irish radio program last year, said they had lost count of the number of qualified candidates who accepted offers and then withdrew before starting because they could not find affordable housing in the city. When a city cannot retain its nurses, its teachers, its bus drivers, it has not just become unaffordable, it has become structurally precarious. The gleaming tech campuses on the Grand Canal dock can function without a thriving middle class in the surrounding neighborhoods for a while. They cannot function without the infrastructure of daily life that an essential workforce provides. Rome, in its late imperial period, maintained its monuments and its forums long after the civic machinery that kept the city functioning had begun to degrade. The marble was still there. The triumphal arches were still standing. But the roads were not being maintained. The grain supply was becoming unreliable. The legions defending the frontier were being paid in promises. Dublin is not Rome. The comparison is not literal. But the structural logic is familiar. You can preserve the surface of prosperity for longer than the foundations can support it. If you have been watching these patterns develop and thinking this channel should investigate the next city in the sequence, hit the like button. It keeps this kind of work alive on the algorithm, and Empire Falls reads every comment. There is a particular cruelty to what is happening in Dublin that distinguishes it from some of the other cities this channel has examined. In Las Vegas or San Francisco, the unraveling happened at least partly to cities that had always been somewhat artificial, built on speculation, on gold rush economics, on the logic of boom and bust. Dublin is different. Dublin is a city with 1,000 years of continuous habitation, with a literary tradition, a civic culture, a deep and complicated relationship with its own land and history. The Irish relationship to land is not abstract. It is visceral. It is written into the national memory in ways that the famine, the land acts, the tenant evictions of the 19th century made permanent. For Irish people of a certain age and background, the idea of owning a home, of having tenure in the land you live on, is not merely a financial aspiration. It is something close to a historical right, hard-won, after generations of dispossession. To watch that aspiration become unattainable in the capital city, in peacetime, in a country with one of the highest GDPs per capita in the European Union, is not just an economic frustration. It carries a weight that the statistics alone do not capture. There is a phrase you hear in Dublin conversations about housing, repeated so often it has almost become a cliché, but that contains a genuine existential anxiety. People say, "I love this city. I just cannot live in it." That sentence, said quietly over a pint in a pub in Stoneybatter or Phibsborough, is the sound of an empire losing its people, not to conquest, not to catastrophe, to a slow arithmetic that has made the city's own citizens feel like strangers in the place they were born. The Irish government is aware of the crisis. It would be unfair to suggest otherwise. Housing for all. The National Housing Plan launched in 2021 set ambitious targets for construction. The Land Development Agency was established to try to unlock state-owned land for affordable development. Vacancy taxes were introduced to try to bring empty properties back into use. Planning reform legislation has moved, albeit slowly, through the Oireachtas. Cost rental housing, a European model in which rents are tied to the cost of building and managing properties rather than to market rates, has been piloted in several Dublin schemes, but the pace of intervention has consistently lagged behind the pace of the crisis. By the time each policy measure reaches implementation, the market has moved further. The targets set in Housing for All have been revised downward. The cost rental units delivered so far represent a fraction of what is needed. The vacancy tax, while symbolically significant, has not yet unlocked meaningful volumes of housing. And crucially, none of the interventions have directly addressed the structural question of whether institutional investment in residential property, the large-scale buying of homes as financial assets, is compatible with a functional, affordable housing market for ordinary people. A housing policy researcher at University College Dublin, in a published paper from 2023, argued that the fundamental problem is a category error in how the Irish state thinks about housing. The paper noted that since the 1980s, successive Irish governments have treated housing primarily as an economic driver, as a sector of activity that generates employment and investment, rather than as social infrastructure, like roads or schools, that the state has an obligation to provide at a level that meets basic need, regardless of whether doing so maximizes market returns. As long as that category error persists, the paper argued, no amount of supply-side intervention will resolve the affordability crisis, because the market being supplied is not the market that ordinary people need. It is a precise and uncomfortable diagnosis. And it describes not just Dublin, but a pattern that has played out in London, in Amsterdam, in Sydney, in Auckland, cities that outsourced the provision of housing to capital markets and discovered, one generation later, that capital markets are not interested in solving social problems. They are interested in generating returns. The broader European context matters here. Dublin is not unique in facing a housing affordability crisis. Berlin, Amsterdam, Lisbon, Zurich, and Barcelona have all experienced versions of the same crisis, with the same underlying dynamics. But Dublin has several features that make its version particularly acute. Its population grew exceptionally fast in a short period, driven by the expansion of the tech sector. Its planning system is exceptionally slow by European standards, making it difficult to build at the pace demand requires. Its rental market is dominated to an unusual degree by institutional investors, and its political culture, shaped by the long dominance of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, two parties with deep historical ties to the property development and construction sector, has been structurally resistant to the kinds of intervention that would directly constrain the financial returns available in the housing market. The result is a city that is simultaneously one of the most economically successful in Europe and one of the least livable for the majority of its working population. That contradiction is not sustainable indefinitely. What does the future of Dublin look like if the current trajectory continues? Scenarios are not predictions, but the patterns are readable. The first scenario is the San Francisco pattern. In this version, Dublin continues to function as a high-productivity tech hub, but the population that actually lives in the city increasingly stratifies into two groups. On one side, very highly paid workers in the tech and finance sectors who can afford Dublin's prices, supplemented by wealthy international students and expatriates. On the other side, a precarious service class, living increasingly far from the city, spending significant portions of their income and life on commuting, with limited security and limited ability to build wealth. The middle, the teachers, the nurses, the small business owners, the families with children, hollows out progressively. The city becomes, in a functional sense, a company town, prosperous on paper, fragile in practice. The second scenario is the Venice pattern. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over time. As Dublin becomes less livable for working families, at wilderness, as the essential workforce disperses, as the social and civic infrastructure erodes, the city begins to lose the vitality that made it attractive in the first place. The tech companies, which have already demonstrated in recent years that they are willing to cut headcount significantly and restructure their European operations based on cost calculations, do not necessarily stay. They came to Dublin because it was cost-effective, English-speaking, and offered access to the European single market. If those calculations change, or if another city offers a more attractive combination of factors, they can leave relatively quickly. And if they leave, Dublin is left with housing prices calibrated to tech sector salaries and an economy that no longer generates those salaries. Venice survived its depopulation by becoming a museum. Dublin would not have that option. The third scenario, the one that Irish policymakers and housing advocates are working toward, is the Amsterdam or Vienna model. Cities that faced similar pressures and responded with decisive, sustained state intervention in the housing market. Vienna, famously, provides public housing to 60% of its population at below-market rents, funded through a social housing model that has been in continuous operation since the 1920s. Amsterdam has used a combination of land value capture, zoning controls, and public housing provision to maintain a degree of affordability that other European capitals have lost. These models did not happen by accident. They required political will, public investment, and a deliberate decision to treat housing as infrastructure rather than as a commodity. Whether Dublin can make that shift, given its political culture and its economic incentives, is the central question of the next decade of Irish urban life. The cracks in Dublin's story are not hidden. They are visible in the length of the housing waiting lists, which currently stand at over 60,000 households in Dublin alone. They are visible in the tent encampments that have appeared in recent years along the Royal Canal and the Grand Canal, in a country that was not supposed to have homelessness of this kind. They are visible in the faces of people in their 30s, who have given up on the idea of ever owning a home in the city they grew up in. They are visible in the classrooms that cannot fill teaching positions, in the hospital wards that run short-staffed, in the buses that do not come. Dublin still has its beauty. The Liffey at dusk, the Georgian squares, the particular quality of Irish social life that no other city in the world has managed to replicate. These things are real, they matter. And they are exactly the kind of things that cities tell themselves stories about while the underlying structure weakens. Every empire believes in its own exceptionalism until the moment it can no longer afford to. Rome told itself it was eternal. The British told themselves the empire was civilizational progress. The Celtic Tiger told itself that this time was different, that Ireland had found a way to be permanently prosperous without the hard choices prosperity requires. Dublin is telling itself a version of that story right now. The economy is strong. The GDP numbers are extraordinary, even accounting for the distortions caused by multinational accounting. The tech companies are still here. The tourists still come. The pubs still fill up. But the nurses are leaving. The teachers are leaving. The young people who were supposed to be the next generation of the city are doing the mental arithmetic, looking at what they earn and what a home costs. And they are making the same choice that IEM Cable have been making for 2 centuries when their own island stopped making sense for them. They are leaving. And when a city starts losing the people who hold it together, not the wealthiest and not the poorest, but the vast, indispensable middle, who make the schools run, and the hospitals function, and the streets feel like a community, that city is not just facing a housing crisis, it is facing a question about what kind of place it wants to be. And it is running out of time to answer. Empires do not fall because they run out of money. They fall because they run out of people who believe the deal is worth it. Dublin still has time, but the pattern is recognizable. And the pattern, as history keeps demonstrating, does not wait for the policy papers to catch up. Tell us in the comments which city you think we should examine next, and subscribe. The next chapter of Empire Falls is already loading.